Lac des Sables, Sainte-Agathe-des-Monts, Quebec, the second week of July, 1938, the hour after supper. Eleanor Napier, 32, out of Westmount, Montreal, kneeling at the fire ring behind the veranda cottage her husband's family had built above the shoreline in 1921, striking a match for the third time because the afternoon's brief rain had gotten into the kindling. Her son Andrew, 9, was not beside her. He had gone up the shore path 20 minutes earlier, toward the Fort family's cottage 2 docks along, and had not come back yet. Eleanor did not know the Fortin parents' first names. 3 summers of polite waves across the water, 3 summers of watching her son disappear up that same path after supper, and she still addressed the mother only as Madame Fortin. In the halting schoolroom French she rarely used the rest of the year. Andrew, meanwhile, called the daughter Celeste, and Celeste, Eleanor had overheard through a screen door the previous August, called her son André, without being asked to, and without anyone correcting her. It was a small fact, and Eleanor had never mentioned it to anyone back in Montreal. In the city, the Napiers' friends were English, their church was English, their son's school was English, and the 2 communities of the country they lived in held themselves at a comfortable, permanent distance from each other. At the lake, something else appeared to happen on the shore path every evening after supper, something her son took for granted, and that she had not yet found the words to describe. The match caught on the 4th try. Behind her, down the shoreline, she heard 2 voices approaching, one calling out in French, one answering in English, both children, both laughing at something that neither language alone would have explained. Eleanor Napier did not yet know what the fire she was about to sit beside, with 2 children who did not fully share a language, would come to mean by the end of that particular summer, or what limits, on other stretches of that same lake, that easy crossing back and forth did not extend to. The fire the Napiers kept was not, technically, remarkable. It was the same fire every family on the lake built after supper, a stack of split wood and driftwood, lit at roughly the same hour, on roughly the same stretch of shoreline. What made Sainte-Agathe and Lac des Sables specific was what had put both languages there in the first place. The town had grown as a French-Canadian settlement from the 1840s, its earliest colonists deliberately encouraged north by a parish priest who believed the railway would secure the region for French-Canadian Catholic families. By the time that same railway, the line Montrealers came to call Le Petit Train du Nord, reached the town in 1892, it carried something the priest had not entirely planned for. Within a generation, so many English-speaking Montreal families had begun summering on the same lake that a second institution, an Anglican parish, had to be built to hold them, standing a short walk from the French parish that had come first. So the shoreline the Napiers and the Fortins shared was not an accident of geography. It was the layered result of 2 separate, deliberate projects, a French-Canadian colonization plan and an English Montreal vacation migration, that had landed, without either side fully intending it, on the same 12 kilometers of shore. What the fire required of a family like the Napiers was smaller than what it required of the town as a whole, showing up on the same evenings, at the same hour, with the same modest patience the ritual demanded of everyone who kept it, and, in Eleanor's case, a French she had never quite trusted herself to use anywhere but here. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Canadian cottage and campfire summer between 1920 and 1980. What the cabin was, what the campfire or the fishing trip or the dock conversation gave the family who kept the ritual, and what they were actually building when they came back to the same lake summer after summer. Not nostalgia for old photographs. The documented social meaning of a ritual a generation of Canadian families arranged their year around. What a Laurentian lake gave 2 languages, for a few weeks each July, was something Montreal itself never quite managed, and the fire never fully solved what the city couldn't solve either. And if you spent your summers on a lake like this, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you spent summers on a Laurentian lake, or one like it, did you have a summer friendship, in a language your own family didn't speak at home, that never quite crossed over into the rest of the year? Next time, the stapled songbooks that gave a country's children, English and French, camp and cottage alike, a soundtrack none of them remembered learning. Back to the fire. By 1945, 7 summers into the arrangement, Andrew Napier was 16, and no longer sat at the fire itself most nights. He sat on the Fortins' porch steps with Celeste and her older cousins, close enough to the lamp inside to hear conversation, but not so close as to be part of it. This was where, regional accounts of Laurentian cottage evenings describe, a different kind of exchange tended to happen. Not the songs of childhood, but the porch talk of a family's elders, delivered in whichever language they had grown up speaking, and rarely translated for the young people listening in. Celeste's grandmother, visiting from Saint-Jérôme for the month of August, told stories on that porch in French, about the railway priest who had sent her own grandfather north with nothing but a land grant and a winter's worth of nerve, about winters before the line reached this far, when a bad autumn could cut a settlement off from the rest of the province for months. Andrew understood perhaps half of what she said outright, and the rest from her hands, her pauses, the way the other adults on the porch went quiet at certain parts. He never asked anyone to translate for him. He had learned, without being told, that translation would have made the stories smaller, that half of what the grandmother was doing was not conveying information, but performing a specific kind of authority that belonged to her language and her memory, not to any English version of the same facts. This was not a formal arrangement. No family on that shoreline had decided, in any conscious way, that a teenager could sit in on a language he only partly followed and come away with something real. It was simply what an unstructured summer evening, with nowhere else to be and nothing scheduled, allowed to happen. A specific kind of listening that a school French class, or a Sunday visit measured in an hour, never gave a child the chance to do. What did Andrew Napier actually carry away from 4 summers of half-understood porch stories told in a language that was never his own, and what, exactly, did it cost the 2 families to keep that porch open to him? The first song of the evening, on the Napier's stretch of shore, did not reliably belong to one language. Andrew had learned Land of the Silver Birch the previous summer, at a day program run out of the Anglican parish hall, and sang it now the way he sang most things, confidently, imprecisely, a half-beat ahead of the tune. Celeste knew a chanson her own grandmother had taught her, something about a clear fountain and a nightingale, and she sang it the same way, confidently, imprecisely, half a beat ahead. Neither child understood every word the other was singing. Neither seemed to mind. This was not, on reflection, unusual for the region. Regional oral histories of Laurentian cottage families from this period describe an evening songbook that crossed languages more freely at the campfire than almost anywhere else in a child's year. Camp songs learned in English at day programs, folk chansons learned in French from grandparents, both delivered around the same fire to an audience that judged the performance, not the vocabulary. What the fire offered, in this specific and narrow sense, was a kind of neutral territory, a place where getting the words wrong in someone else's language cost a child nothing, because everyone at the fire had, at some point, gotten some song's words wrong too. Eleanor Napier, listening from her seat at the fire's edge, understood perhaps a third of what Celeste was singing, and could not have explained why it moved her more than the English song had. It was not the content of either song. It was the specific fact of hearing them offered back to back, without translation, without correction, without either child treating the other's language as a performance that needed to be understood to be enjoyed. In Montreal, this would have been remarkable enough to mention at a dinner party. At Lac des Sables, on a Tuesday evening in July, it was simply what happened once the fire caught, and the quiet settled enough for someone to start. What, exactly, was a child carrying away from a summer spent memorizing songs in a language they could not yet speak? And what happened to that specific, effortless fluency once September returned them to a city where the two languages went back to holding themselves at arm's length? Some of what passed between the Napiers and the Fortons over those summers left a paper trail, of a modest kind. Regional cottage country archives from this period preserve exactly the sort of object that would have traveled between two families like these. Handwritten postcards, sent between visits, mixing both languages in the same few lines without apparent self-consciousness. A child's note asking when the other family would be back at the lake. A mother's line of thanks for a jar of preserves, signed off in whichever language came first to hand that day. None of this depended on either family becoming fluent in the other's language. What it depended on was something smaller and more specific to cottage country, an entire summer's worth of unstructured proximity, with no institution, no school, no church, no workplace, sorting the two languages back into their separate corners, the way the city did every day of the other 11 months. The train that had first carried the Napiers north on Le Petit Train du Nord was, in this narrow sense, doing something its builder had never quite intended. A railway conceived to plant French-Canadian settlement in the north had, within 2 generations, become the same railway carrying English Montreal north to summer beside it. This did not make the two communities the same, or erase what divided them the rest of the year. It made the lake, for a few weeks each July and August, a place where the division was simply not load-bearing, where a family's language mattered less than whether they showed up at the same dock, the same fire, the same porch, at roughly the same hour, summer after summer. What did it actually take, beyond the railway, beyond the 2 churches, beyond the accident of 2 cottages sitting 2 docks apart, to keep that specific, narrow kind of closeness alive, for 4 decades, on one lake, when the rest of the province around it did not manage the same thing? By the early 1950s, Sainte-Agathe-des-Monts had become, in a documented and fairly specific sense, one thing to 2 different audiences at once. Regional tourism history describes the town in these years as the Laurentians' oldest and busiest resort center, a place with the largest English-speaking summer cottage population anywhere in the region outside Mont-Tremblant, and at the same time, a thoroughly French-Canadian town, with its own parish, its own French institutions, its own working life that had nothing to do with the cottagers at all. The 2 populations were not evenly distributed along the shore. English Montreal families clustered on certain points and bays, closer to the Anglican Church and to hotels built to their taste. French-Canadian families, whether long settled or vacationing themselves, held the rest. Andrew and Celeste's 2 docks sat, as it happened, on a stretch of shoreline where that geography blurred rather than held, not because the Napiers or the Fortons were unusual people, but because Lac des Sables' particular shape put certain bays within easy walking distance of each other, regardless of which community had settled which side first. Other lakes in the region, and other stretches of this same lake, did not blur nearly so easily. A family's income, its religion, its access to a hotel with a French or an English staff, its standing with the resort operators who set the social tone of a given point, all of these sorted families into shoreline neighborhoods as reliably as language did, sometimes more reliably. The fire the Napiers and Fortons built together, in other words, was real, and it was also a specific, somewhat fortunate exception to a broader pattern the region did not apply evenly to everyone who came looking for a lake to summer beside. What, precisely, did that broader pattern look like for a family the shoreline did not welcome as easily as it welcomed the Napiers. Here the record requires honesty rather than comfort. The same Laurentian shoreline that made room, however imperfectly, for two Christian language communities to sing at the same fire, drew a harder and better documented line elsewhere. Through the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s, resorts and hotels across Ontario cottage country, the Laurentians, and other Canadian lake regions displayed signage turning Jewish visitors away outright, and archival collections held today by the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Ontario Jewish Archives preserve photographs of exactly this signage, including, specifically, from Sainte-Agathe itself. Families who kept an account of it later remembered hotels that took a reservation, then asked which church a guest belonged to, and evicted Jewish guests on the spot when the answer came back wrong, sometimes, by one recorded account, packing their bags and setting them outside in the middle of the night. This was not universally applied by every hotel, and it was not limited to any one language community's establishments. Both English and French-run resorts in the region are documented as having practiced it. It was contested at the time. B'nai B'rith brought legal challenges against exactly these restrictions, and it was, by the same record, slow and incomplete in being undone. None of this touched the Napier or Fortin fire directly. Neither family in this account was Jewish. Neither had reason, in the ordinary course of a summer, to notice the signs on hotels they had no reason to approach. That is, in fact, the point worth sitting with. The specific, narrow tolerance that let two Christian language communities share a shoreline did not require anyone keeping it to examine what the same shoreline was doing to a third community a few docks or a few resorts away. A neutral fire is not the same thing as a neutral lake. Documenting the first honestly means documenting the second as well, not as a footnote, but as the limit the warmer story was always sitting inside. What did it take, decades later, to legally undo restrictions that had operated in plain view, on hotel doors and printed advertisements, for the better part of 2 generations? The Napiers' cottage got hydroelectric service in 1961, the same decade Quebec's remaining rural electrical cooperatives were folded into a single province-wide system, and the gap between city and cottage power finally closed for good. 2 years later, construction crews were already grading the route of the new Laurentian autoroute through the valley the old railway had followed since 1892. The same right-of-way Curé Lebel had once imagined carrying French-Canadian settlers north, now carrying a different kind of traffic, one car at a time, at a speed the old snow trains never approached. Passenger service on the line held on, unevenly, into the 1970s. It made its final run in November 1981. What the highway gave the Napiers, and every family like them, was speed, a Friday evening drive that reached the lake in under 2 hours, instead of a morning given over entirely to trains and porters and platform waits. What it did not give either family was the specific, unhurried overlap the old arrangement had produced almost by accident. The shared platform, the shared wait, the shared discomfort of a slow trip that put English and French Montreal in the same railway car for 3 hours, whether they spoke to each other or not. A car took a family door to door. It also meant that a family no longer had to sit, even briefly, beside anyone whose year did not otherwise resemble their own. Andrew Napier, 41 years old by the time the highway opened, drove his own children north in under 2 hours, the summer it did. He mentioned to no one, that first year, that the trip felt shorter and somehow thinner than the one he remembered, that something about arriving, without ever having had to wait for anyone else's train, had made the lake feel, for the first time, like simply another place his family owned, rather than a place 2 languages had been quietly sharing since before he was born. The fire ring on the Napier shore stayed where it had always been. What hydroelectric service gave the family? Light at the flick of a switch, a refrigerator, eventually a television brought up from Montreal in the back of the same car that had replaced the train. What it did not give them: a reason for a child to spend 4 unhurried summers half following a grandmother's stories in a language that was never quite his. Andrew Napier did not know, in 1938, that this was what the fire and the shore path had been building. He understood it only much later, driving his own children north on a highway that got them there faster and left them, once they'd arrived, with less reason to wander up anyone else's shore path at all. The fire ring had known what to do with a slow train and an unhurried evening. No one had thought to tell the autoroute to ask. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Canadian cottage summer meant to the people who made it their yearly ritual, subscribe. There are more lakes, more campfires, more fishing trips at dawn, and more quiet nights on the dock that were the best part of someone's whole year, and were never described that way at the time, because they didn't need to be. What a Laurentian lake gave 2 languages, for a few weeks each July, was something Montreal itself never quite managed, and the fire never fully solved what the city couldn't solve either. And if you have a memory of a cabin, a campfire, a song, a shore path to a neighbor's cottage, put it in the comments. If you spent summers on a Laurentian lake, or one like it, did you have a summer friendship, in a language your own family didn't speak at home, that never quite crossed over into the rest of the year? Next time, the stapled songbooks that gave a country's children, English and French, camp and cottage alike, a soundtrack none of them remembered learning,